Crescent Abbey had the sort of dignified shabbiness that Flaxborough residents admired in buildings but would not tolerate in their own households. Its stone walls, warmed by centuries of mild disuse, were draped in early summer ivy, and the annual garden open day brought out the usual mixture of gentle piety, horticultural competitiveness, and opportunistic snacking. Inspector Purbright, who possessed an unpretentious fondness for ecclesiastical pastries, had accepted a leaflet promising complimentary scone with any historical tour. That leaflet, now folded neatly in his breast pocket, had partly justified to himself the decision to spend a Saturday afternoon on Abbey grounds under what the weather reports described as a sun of a cooperative nature. By 11:40, a modest crowd had gathered for the customary noon bell, an amiable tradition explained at length by Brother Edgar, the senior of the 3 monks still in residence. The bell, he informed visitors with mild tremor and disproportionate solemnity, was not merely rung, but pleasingly tolled, as it had been since its casting in 1723. It was therefore all the more conspicuous when, at 12 precisely, nothing happened. The silence drifted across the courtyard with the awkward persistence of a guest who has mistaken the day of a dinner invitation. A few visitors glanced up at the bell tower. Others checked their watches. Purbright, who rarely trusted clocks or ceremonial expectations, merely observed the expressions of the monks, which were far more telling than any malfunction of metal or rope. Brother Llewellyn was the first to act. A thin, restless man of uncertain age, he scurried across the cloister walk and vanished into the base of the tower with the air of someone hoping an audience might forget he existed. Brother Matthew, meanwhile, attempted a reassuring smile at the visitors, only to craft something closer to a rictus of impending apology. At length Brother Llewellyn re-emerged, dust smudging his brown habit. "There appears," he announced, in a voice that wavered between theatrical tragedy and indigestion, "to have been a slight mechanical failure." He made a vague gesture suggestive of irreparable catastrophe. The explanation failed to convince even the less attentive members of the crowd. Mechanical failures, in the experience of Flaxborough residents, involved raucous noises, bent appendages, and usually a nephew with an invoice pad. Silence was not generally thought to signify anything mechanical at all. Purbright, without drawing notice, ambled toward the tower door. It hung open, apparently by accident or distraction. Within, a narrow, dusty staircase wound its way upward. On the first step lay a small curl of coarse fibre, pale, stiff, recently torn. He did not touch it, for reasons both procedural and instinctive. Instead, he merely looked upward, eyes following the path of the rope through a series of wooden guides. Halfway up, the rope ended, abruptly, not frayed, as one might expect from age or over-enthusiastic ringing, but cleanly sliced. Purbright's expression did not alter. He simply backed out, almost apologetically, as though trespassing on the tower's privacy. Outside again, Mrs. Glossop, a woman whose devotion to detail was sincere but seldom accurate, had already begun telling a small audience that the monks have misplaced the clapper, an assertion she supported with 2 entirely irrelevant anecdotes about her cat. The atmosphere rippled with growing curiosity. Brother Edgar attempted his own clarification, a simple issue of wear, but this too found little purchase. Brother Matthew's contribution, a momentary oversight in rope upkeep, sounded suspiciously like the sort of phrase devised by someone who had recently swallowed a pamphlet on public relations. Purbright made no public comment. He merely observed how often Brother Llewellyn's eyes flitted toward the bell tower, as though expecting it to denounce him. The garden open day proceeded, but with diminished enthusiasm. The hydrangea competition concluded in an uneasy sort of triumph for Mrs. Whipple, whose flowers were unquestionably lovely, but whose temperament discouraged sustained applause. Volunteers continued dispensing tea with excessive briskness, as though expecting scandal to require fortification. Purbright accepted his complimentary scone. He ate it with calm deliberation, acknowledging silently that its dryness suggested doctrinal austerity rather than culinary skill. As he finished, Mr. Chigwell, the Abbey's secular bursar, approached in the manner of someone hoping not to be observed doing so. "Inspector," Chigwell said, clearing his throat as though the word itself might attract public scrutiny, "I trust you won't find today's, irregularity too deserving of official interest?" "Interest," Purbright replied gently, "is a matter of proportion, Mr. Chigwell. A silent bell is, on the scale of civic tumult, a rather modest event." Chigwell's relief was premature. Before he could formulate a reply, Purbright added, "But one does wonder when modest events come in such tidy forms as a cleanly cut rope." The bursar paled. "Cut," he whispered. Purbright inclined his head in a manner that could, with effort, be interpreted as non-committal. "One imagines so, though I dare say further examination will provide clarity." Chigwell's lips quivered like those of a man whose conscience was performing calisthenics. "Inspector? Surely there's no need for, the full machinery of inquiry." "The machinery," Purbright said, "is quite mild at first." He left the bursar with that comforting thought and wandered back into the crowd. The remainder of the garden open day dissolved with the peculiar swiftness of an event that has failed to meet its own expectations. Visitors drifted out through the Abbey gate in small, murmuring clusters, each carrying a version of the bell mystery more colourful than the last. Flaxborough residents had always demonstrated a remarkable capacity to enlarge an incident through communal speculation, much as one might inflate a small balloon until it resembled a weather system. Inspector Purbright walked back toward the town centre at an unhurried pace. The afternoon sun had taken on a slightly more reflective warmth, the kind that encouraged people to slow their steps and consider the peculiarities of life, of which on this particular Saturday there were already several to ponder. By the time Purbright reached the High Street, news of the silent bell had made its way into the cafes and shops with the agility of a seasoned gossip. Mrs. Ingledew, proprietress of the town's most assertively floral tea shop, was recounting to her customers a detailed description of suspicious figures she claimed to have seen lurking near the Abbey grounds earlier that week. These figures turned out, on closer inquiry, to be two teenage boys carrying fishing rods, but the distinction mattered little to Mrs. Ingledew's sense of narrative timing. Purbright stepped inside the tea shop primarily for a cup of tea, but also because it served as an ideal vantage point from which to observe the town's conversational metabolism. "It's sabotage," Mrs. Ingledew declared, with the conviction of someone diagnosing a friend's rash from across a room. Abbey bells do not simply fall silent. They require a firm hand and a purpose behind such stillness. A gentleman at the next table, stirring sugar into his tea with unnecessary vigour, nodded. "I've always said those monks keep too many secrets. There's no transparency in cloisters." Purbright allowed himself a soft sigh. He appreciated Flaxborough's industrious rumour mills, though he frequently wished the machinery produced a steadier grade of information. He placed his order and took a seat near the window. Through the glass he could see Mr. Chigwell hurrying past, wiping perspiration from his brow, his gait reminiscent of a man trying to outrun his own conscience. The bursar did not glance toward the tea shop, which suggested he was unwilling to risk conversation with anyone, even inadvertently. Purbright filed the observation away, not as evidence but as part of the slow accumulation of character assessment on which so many investigations depended. His tea arrived with a slice of lemon placed so precisely on the saucer that it suggested architectural planning. As he lifted the cup, Mrs. Glossop entered the shop, already mid-sentence. "And I said to him, no such thing as a harmless silence, especially around monks." She stopped abruptly when she noticed Purbright. "Inspector, you're just the person we were discussing." "I imagined as much," Purbright replied gently. "Well," she said, lowering her voice but not enough to diminish its audibility, "you'll want to know that I saw something queer this morning. I was walking my cat. Yes, walking, Inspector. He suffers from ennui if confined. And I looked through the Abbey gate long before the event began. There was a man standing near the tower door." Purbright offered a mild, encouraging nod. "Tall fellow," she continued, "or possibly short. Hard to tell at a distance, but I recall thinking the way he stood was purposeful, as though he were trying to listen for something." "Inside the tower?" Purbright asked. "Or above it," she said cryptically, clearly delighted by the drama inherent in ambiguity. "I didn't recognize him. Not a local, I'm certain." The inspector thanked her with the sort of gratitude that carried both politeness and caution. He never dismissed Mrs. Glossop outright. Her observations were rarely accurate, but sometimes unexpectedly fruitful, like a clock that struck true on its third incorrect attempt. After she left, Purbright finished his tea and decided that a quiet walk to Crescent Lane might be useful. The Abbey's bursar, Chigwell, lived there, and although Purbright had no intention of questioning him formally, he did wonder whether the man's nervousness had intensified since their earlier encounter. The lane was shaded by chestnut trees beginning to shed their petals in gentle, fluttering waves. Chigwell's house appeared modest but meticulously kept, the sort of dwelling that hinted at personal supervision rather than hired maintenance. Purbright saw no movement inside, but the blinds were drawn at angles too deliberate to be casual. He did not knock. Some conversations benefited from a delay. Instead, he strolled on, letting the town's rhythm guide him. Passing the newsagents, he spotted Mr. Cobbett, the town's unofficial correspondent of all things dramatic, leaning against a stack of newspapers. "Heard about the Abbey bell, Inspector?" Cobbett asked, with a grin that suggested a carnival rather than a minor ecclesiastical malfunction. "Terrible business. Ropes snapped clean off, they say." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Who is they?" "People who know ropes," Cobbett said vaguely. "Or people who've seen ropes, or talked about ropes." He shrugged. "Word spreads." "That it does," Purbright replied. He walked on, threading his way past a group of teenagers, theorizing that the bell had been stolen by a collector of antique sound devices. Another insisted the monks had been bribed into silence by a rival abbey seeking to outperform them in the annual regional heritage competition. He made no corrections. Flaxborough's youth enjoyed their imaginative constructs, and Purbright recognized the harmlessness of such conspiracies compared to the more intricate adult forms. But beneath the chatter, he sensed the presence of a more grounded concern. Someone had cut that rope with intention. Someone who knew enough about the bell's mechanism to pinpoint the precise place where the cut would silence it without causing visible wreckage, and someone who, for reasons yet unknown, wished to avoid drawing attention. By early evening the town had quietened, though not in spirit. The day's gossip had fermented into several streams of speculation, each finding its preferred channels: the pubs, the church hall, the benches near the river. Purbright walked back toward the police station, passing through Market Square. A small group stood under the lamp-post outside the chemist's, talking in low tones. He caught only fragments. "Valuable old thing, not insured properly, but..." monks too embarrassed. But the gist was unmistakable. The narrative was evolving, shifting from curiosity to suspicion. As he reached the station door, Purbright paused for a final glance at the Abbey's silhouette in the distance. The bell tower rose above the treetops with its usual solemnity, yet the knowledge of its forced silence added a faintly accusatory note to its outline. Something had been set in motion, deliberately, carefully, and it was only a matter of time before the next ripple surfaced. Purbright stepped inside, loosening his coat. The day had grown long, but the threads of the quiet puzzle had only begun to reveal themselves. He intended to follow each one with the unhurried patience for which he was known, and which, he suspected, would soon prove essential. The next morning arrived with a grey, contemplative light that seemed appropriate for the lingering unease in Flaxborough. As Inspector Purbright walked toward Crescent Abbey, the town had already begun rehashing the previous day's events with renewed enthusiasm. He passed two elderly men debating whether a bell rope could be cut by lightning, and a young woman arguing that monks, being close to the divine, should theoretically be immune to sabotage. Purbright did not attempt to correct any of them. He doubted they would appreciate the intrusion. A faint mist clung to the abbey grounds, giving the stone arches an air of polite mystery. Brother Matthew answered the inspector's knock at the side entrance with a mixture of guilt and over-prepared cordiality. The young monk bowed with such exaggerated reverence that it seemed borrowed from a guidebook. "Inspector Purbright," Brother Matthew said, "we are honoured by your visit, truly honoured, though naturally we wish it were under less dramatic circumstances." Purbright stepped inside with a mild nod. "Nothing too dramatic at present. A bell that refuses to ring is a small rebellion in the grand scheme of things." "Still," Matthew insisted, "the Abbey prides itself on reliability." The interior smelled faintly of beeswax and damp stone. Brother Matthew guided him to a modest sitting room where Brother Edgar was already waiting, hands folded neatly over his lap, as though he'd been anticipating an examination. The elderly monk looked serene, but his eyes flickered with the evasive softness of someone mentally rearranging his account of things. Purbright sat. "Yesterday's mishap was unfortunate. I imagine it must have caused some distress among the brethren." "A momentary disquiet," Brother Edgar replied. "The bell, dear Inspector, is symbolic. Its voice is old, dependable. To have it silenced, it feels rather like misplacing a friend." "Misplaced friends are often found," Purbright said gently. "Or, as in this case, reconnected." Brother Edgar's smile faltered. Purbright continued, "When I glanced at the bell rope yesterday, I noticed the end was clean, as though cut deliberately. Would you know anything about the rope's recent condition?" Matthew lowered his gaze, Edgar's fingertips pressed together in a tight steeple. "It had seemed sturdy," he murmured, "but one cannot always judge the health of a rope from its outer appearance." "A timely philosophical point," Purbright said, "though physics tends to leave fewer uncertainties." Brother Matthew shifted in his seat, adjusting his robe with unnecessary fervour. "Perhaps," he said, "someone unfamiliar with the bell attempted to ring it earlier in the morning. Visitors sometimes wander. A misguided tug—" Purbright raised an eyebrow. Would an unfamiliar hand have such tidy technique? The cut was straight, almost elegant. A strained silence settled. The inspector let it rest for a moment, then stood. "If I might look at the tower, merely to satisfy curiosity." Brother Edgar nodded with reluctant generosity. "Of course. We'll accompany you." The climb up the tower was narrow and awkward, the steps worn in shallow curves that hinted at centuries of patient footfall. At the midpoint, Purbright paused, examining the place where the rope had been severed. Brother Matthew moved slightly ahead, perhaps in an attempt to block the inspector's access. Purbright merely observed without comment. The bell chamber itself was a curious blend of dust, old iron, and unexpected tidiness. The bell hung motionless, its bronze surface mottled with patches of age. Purbright noted the wheel mechanism, the wooden arc used for pulling, had a faint rectangular mark across one section, as though a small metal plate had been pressed there recently. He touched the wood lightly. "Has this wheel been repaired?" "Not to my knowledge," Edgar said, though the pause before his answer suggested a silent mental search for an alternative reply. Purbright nodded slowly, storing the detail. On the descent, they encountered a lay volunteer, Mrs. Hilda Pratt, who was scrubbing a stone floor with aggressive concentration. She stopped the moment the inspector appeared, wiping her hands on her apron with an expression that hovered between reverence and complaint. "Oh, Inspector Purbright!" she exclaimed. "I didn't expect anyone up the tower today. Frightfully dangerous, if you ask me. That staircase is a menace. I told Brother Llewellyn he should put up railings, but he muttered something about historical integrity." "Have you worked here long, Mrs. Pratt?" Purbright asked. 6 years, she said proudly. "I do the polishing, dusting, flower arranging, and occasionally the pointing out of hazards." "Were you here yesterday morning?" "Certainly. I arrived at 9:30. I saw the monks going about their business as usual. Except Brother Llewellyn, he seemed rather flustered, nearly knocked over the candle-stand." Purbright tilted his head. "Did you see anyone else? Any visitors, perhaps?" Mrs. Pratt pursed her lips in concentration. "There was one fellow, tall, or possibly medium, wearing a dark coat. He came down the path from the bell tower. Around 10, looked annoyed, as though the place had failed to live up to his expectations, drove off in a very shiny car." "Do you recall the colour?" "Blue," she said without hesitation. "The sort of blue that suggests a great many car waxes have been sacrificed to achieve it." "Did he speak to anyone?" "Not that I saw, but he did stand near the tower for a spell, just looking up." That aligned a little too neatly with Mrs. Glossop's early morning sighting, though the inspector knew better than to proclaim consistency too soon. Coincidence had a way of performing convincing impressions of truth. He thanked Mrs. Pratt and turned to leave the Abbey grounds. The monks watched his departure from the cloister walk, their robes shifting slightly in the breeze, their expressions a blend of apprehension and polite concealment. As he reached the gate, a familiar voice called out, "Inspector!" A breathless Brother Llewellyn approached, his habit flapping like a startled bird. "I should like to clarify something," he said, wringing his hands as though drying them on invisible towels. "When I mentioned a mechanical failure yesterday, I fear I may have conveyed the wrong impression. I was misinformed." "By whom?" Purbright asked serenely. Llewellyn swallowed. I assumed the rope had torn naturally. One does not immediately leap to sabotage." "One might if one knew of a motive," Purbright said. The monk's face drained of colour. "Motive? There is no motive here, Inspector, none whatsoever." Purbright regarded him with mild sympathy. "Most things have motives, brother, even silence." The monk made a strangled noise of agreement, then excused himself with a hasty bow. Outside the Abbey walls, Purbright began the slow walk back to town. The air had grown warmer, the mist lifting to reveal a brightening sky, but the inspector sensed that beneath the Abbey's quiet stone exterior something was shifting, uncertainty perhaps, or fear. And somewhere in Flaxborough a man with a shiny blue car was nursing a grievance, a secret, or a purpose he had not yet revealed. By mid-afternoon, Purbright was back in his office at the Flaxborough, Police station, a modest room whose window overlooked the car park and a small, optimistic rosebush that had bloomed valiantly despite repeated assaults from passing delivery vans. He had barely set down his hat before Acting Chief Constable Chimes appeared in the doorway, radiating an impatience that suggested he had rehearsed his entrance in the corridor. "Purbright," Chimes announced, "I think we can wrap up this Abbey business rather neatly." Purbright looked up with polite curiosity. "Indeed, sir?" "Yes," Chimes said, marching in with the stiff stride of someone determined to appear in command. "We've had a useful report from Councillor Rendell, very civic-minded man, says he knows precisely who would have reason to meddle with that bell." Purbright felt a familiar internal sigh, the kind reserved for moments when enthusiasm outpaced discernment. "And who might that be?" "One Cyril Madden," Chimes declared triumphantly, as though unveiling a prize. "Former Abbey volunteer, you recall him. Thin chap, balding prematurely, very big on composting. Apparently he had some spat with the monks over parking privileges." "Parking privileges?" Purbright repeated calmly. "Something about him wanting a reserved space near the herb garden. They refused. He resigned in protest, and now, evidently, he's exacting revenge." Purbright's expression remained politely neutral. "By cutting a bell rope?" "Symbolic gesture, isn't it?" Chimes said. "A way to show the monks they can't silence him. Councillor Rendell says Madden was oddly passionate about his volunteer work. People like that hold grudges. Does Councillor Rendell have direct knowledge of Mr. Madden's whereabouts yesterday?" Chimes paused. "Well, not as such, but the man's temperament makes him a likely candidate." Purbright folded his hands. "Temperament has its uses in crime, sir, but it seldom replaces opportunity or motive." "Oh, nonsense," Chimes barked. "You detectives are always looking for complexity where simplicity will do. I propose we bring Madden in for questioning tonight." Purbright offered a gentle, well-practiced smile. "If you wish it, sir, though I might suggest that a conversation with Mr. Madden be approached carefully. Some individuals become rather theatrical when faced with accusation." Chimes waved a dismissive hand. "Theatrical people always confess, can't resist the drama." With that he strode out, leaving the door slightly ajar in a gesture that managed to be both careless and authoritative. Purbright closed the door quietly and leaned back in his chair. Cyril Madden was indeed a peculiar figure, earnest, slightly brittle, and given to intense enthusiasms, but the inspector found it difficult to imagine him scaling a bell tower to stage an act of symbolic sabotage. Madden was passionate about herbs, certainly, but hardly athletic. There was also the matter of the mysterious man in the shiny blue car, whose presence near the tower at an unusual hour aligned poorly with the theory of a disgruntled volunteer exacting petty revenge. Still, it would do no harm to speak with Madden. If nothing else, the conversation would help eliminate another thread from the puzzle. Before leaving, Purbright reviewed the notes he had penciled that morning. The clean cut of the rope, the rectangular mark on the wheel, the evasiveness of the monks and the sightings of the annoyed stranger. Each detail pointed to intent rather than accident, and to a hand more decisive than that of a man aggrieved by parking policy. He put on his coat and walked toward Madden's house on the east side of town, a neighbourhood of modest brick cottages where gardens tended to reflect the personalities of their owners. Cyril Madden's garden was a testament to his devotion, herbs in orderly rows, a small greenhouse in the back, and a compost heap arranged with geometric precision. Madden himself opened the door with a look of mild surprise, quickly followed by self-conscious eagerness. "Inspector, hello, please. Come in. I've just made nettle tea, though most people find it rather alarming." Purbright declined the tea with a gentle shake of the head, and followed Madden into a narrow sitting room lined with botanical prints. The man sat nervously, hands clasped. "I assume," Madden began, "this is about the bell. People have been talking. Mrs. Glossop told me she heard it had fallen off the tower entirely, or perhaps exploded." "I can assure you it has done neither," Purbright said. "Its quiet yesterday was the result of a severed rope." "Severed?" Madden echoed, eyes widening. "Good heavens!" "You were once a volunteer at the Abbey," Purbright continued. "May I ask why you left?" Madden's expression tightened like a drawstring purse. It was a misunderstanding. Brother Llewellyn refused to acknowledge the importance of designated footpaths in the herb garden. I merely suggested signage. He accused me of inflexible thinking. One cannot serve in such an environment. "I see," Purbright said mildly. "And where were you yesterday morning?" "In my greenhouse from 8:30 until nearly noon. I was repotting lemon balm. Mrs. Derry across the lane can confirm. She complained that my radio was too loud." The inspector nodded. It was not a glamorous alibi, but it had the ring of truth. Madden's voice betrayed no defensiveness, only earnestness, tinged with lingering disappointment. "Did you visit the Abbey recently?" Purbright asked. "No," Madden said. "Not since the disagreement." "Did you notice anyone taking a particular interest in the bell or the monks?" "Only Mr. Cope," Madden said after a moment's thought. "Vivian Cope, the property developer. He's been sniffing around the Abbey for months, hoping, I suspect, that the monks will sell off a corner of their land. He made several remarks at the council meeting last week about underutilized heritage plots. The monks disliked him intensely." The name rang faintly familiar. Cope had been involved in a contentious rezoning proposal recently, which had made him rather unpopular among the preservation-minded residents. "Did Mr. Cope attend the garden open day yesterday?" Purbright asked. Madden shrugged. "I didn't see him, but he owns a rather flashy blue roadster. Hard to miss if it was nearby." That fitted uncomfortably well with the descriptions given by Mrs. Glossop and Mrs. Pratt. Purbright thanked Madden, who seemed relieved to have his conscience inspected and found free of blight. Walking back toward the station, Purbright let the town's quiet streets wash over him. A few shops were closing for the evening. A dog barked lazily from behind a gate. The tranquility contrasted sharply with the undercurrents he sensed around the Abbey. At the station he found a note from Chimes. "Bring in Madden tomorrow. This will all be sorted quickly." Purbright folded the note and placed it in his drawer. Nothing about the Abbey affair, he felt, would be sorted quickly. Certainly not if Cyril Madden was the centerpiece of the theory. There were deeper motives at work, motives that required more than petty resentment, motives that a man in a shiny blue car might understand far better than a gardener with a bruised ego. The rope had been cut with precision. The wheel bore a mark of deliberate tampering. And somewhere in all this the monks were hiding a truth they were reluctant to name. Purbright intended to find that truth, however patiently it needed to be coaxed from silence. Purbright arrived early at the station the next morning, not because the Abbey affair demanded haste, but because he preferred to approach puzzle-like matters with a clear head and a quiet environment. Both were more easily found before Acting Chief Constable Chimes began his brisk circulations of the premises, which tended to generate more administrative weather than progress. He reviewed his notes once more, lingering particularly on the rectangular impression left on the bell wheel. It was the sort of inconspicuous mark that most would overlook, but to Purbright it hinted at an intrusion both calculated and unhurried. A simple cut rope might be attributed to mischief, a mechanical imprint suggested preparation. Chimes arrived shortly after 9, sweeping into the office with the confident step of a man eager to announce success prematurely. "Purbright," he began triumphantly, I've arranged for Madden to come in at noon. We'll get a confession out of him in time for the afternoon bulletin." Purbright set his pencil down with deliberate calm. "It would be prudent, sir, to speak with all parties connected to the Abbey before favouring any one theory." "Nonsense," Chimes replied, adjusting his tie as though the conversation itself required a ceremonial straightening. "Councillor Rendell says the man is unstable, and if Rendell says it, that's good enough for me. The council does have insight into such matters." Purbright thought privately that the council possessed insight only into its own anxieties, but he responded with a respectful nod. "Very well, sir. I may take a short walk before noon." Chimes waved a half-hearted acknowledgement. "Do as you like. Just be ready when Madden arrives." Purbright left the station and headed once again toward Crescent Abbey. The morning was bright and moderately cheerful, though a brisk wind kept the air moving, as if the town itself were restless. The Abbey stood in its usual composed silence, the bell tower rising with an air of dignified indifference to the commotion it had stirred. Brother Matthew was sweeping the cloister walk when Purbright entered the grounds. His movements were overly energetic for someone engaged in a task usually performed with gentle monotony. When he saw the inspector, his sweeping intensified as though cleanliness were now a matter of urgent moral principle. "Good morning, Brother Matthew," Purbright said pleasantly. "I hope the day finds you less troubled than yesterday." The monk froze momentarily, then resumed sweeping. "We remain unsettled, Inspector. The Abbey depends on its routines. Routine is the structure of devotion. Structures do inconvenience those who wish to disturb them," Purbright observed. He left the monk to contemplate that and walked toward the tower. The cut rope had been taken away, presumably for repair, but he wished to re-examine the wheel mechanism before the monks found reason to make it less accessible. The tower door creaked faintly when he pushed it open. Dust motes swirled in the slanted morning light. The stairs remained as narrow and inconvenient as ever, but Purbright climbed them with steady patience. At the landing where the rope had been severed, he paused again to study the area. No fresh disturbances, but he noticed something he had overlooked before. A small wooden wedge lying behind a beam, only visible when one stood at a particular angle. He crouched and picked it up. It was a simple piece, recently broken, possibly from a tool or lever, used to brace the wheel during tampering. The break was fresh enough that the wood retained its pale interior. He held it thoughtfully, then slipped it into his pocket. Not evidence yet, but perhaps a whisper of method. At the top, the bell chamber looked as it had the previous day, dusty, solemn, and faintly resentful of intrusion. The rectangular mark remained faint, but unmistakable. It had not been caused by anything naturally found in the tower. A metal plate, perhaps part of a clamp or mechanical brace, had pressed against the wheel with firm purpose. Purbright ran his fingertips lightly across the mark. The shape was too precise to be accidental. As he descended, he heard footsteps below. Brother Edgar awaited him, standing at the bottom of the stairs with the composed patience of a man hoping to intercept curiosity. "I thought I might find you here," Edgar said mildly. "It is unusual to see so much interest in our old bell." "Unusual circumstances draw interest," Purbright replied, "especially when the circumstances seem carefully shaped." Edgar's eyes flickered briefly, betraying a hint of tension. "I assure you, Inspector, there is nothing of significance about our bell beyond age and sentiment." "Most old things," Purbright said, "collect significance over time, whether they intend to or not." The monk inclined his head politely, but without conviction. They walked out into the cloister. The wind stirred the ivy, making a soft tapping against the stone. "Tell me, Brother Edgar," Purbright continued, "is the Abbey facing any particular difficulties, financial or otherwise?" Edgar paused. The Abbey, like many institutions reliant on donations, must sometimes navigate lean periods, but nothing dire. "And Mr. Vivian Cope?" Purbright asked. "I understand he has shown interest in your land." A subtle tightness entered Edgar's posture. "Mr. Cope has made proposals. We have declined them." "Yet he persists?" "He is a man accustomed to being accommodated," Edgar said, the faintest note of distaste colouring his tone. "Such men rarely accept refusal gracefully." Purbright considered this. "Was he here yesterday morning?" "I did not see him," Edgar replied. "But then, I am not everywhere." That, Purbright reflected, was a more revealing answer than the monk intended. He thanked Edgar and stepped out through the main gate. The road outside sloped gently toward town, and from the crest he could see a blue roadster parked incongruously near the old stone wall, a polished, ostentatious machine that looked entirely out of place next to the modest greenery of the Abbey. The driver leaned against it, arms folded, as though staking a claim by posture alone. Vivian Cope was a man of assertive shoulders and an expression that approached charm without ever quite arriving. When he noticed Purbright approaching, he straightened with an air of anticipated confrontation. "Inspector," Cope said, offering a cool smile, "I gather the monks have you running errands on their behalf." Purbright stopped a few feet away. "Not errands, Mr. Cope. Observations." "Well, observe away," Cope said. "But I warn you, they're being slippery. Monks always are when money's involved. Are you suggesting the Abbey's finances concern you?" "They should concern the entire town," Cope replied, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. "Prime land sitting idle while businesses struggle for space. I've made them generous offers. They decline with pious smiles. It's infuriating." Purbright nodded calmly. "Were you here yesterday morning?" Cope hesitated a second too long. "Passing by, I enjoy a morning drive." "Near the bell tower?" Another hesitation. "I walk where I please. There's no law against looking at architecture." "No," Purbright agreed gently. "But timing is often of interest." Cope's jaw tightened. "Are you accusing me of something?" "Not at all," Purbright said, "merely gathering the smallest details. They tend to prove useful." Cope gave a thin smile. "Details don't concern me, Inspector. Outcomes do." Purbright watched him climb back into the roadster, the engine purring with expensive irritation. As the car sped away, the inspector felt the faint, satisfying click of a new piece sliding into place, not a solution, but the shape of a path ahead. And with the wooden wedge in his pocket and a fresh contradiction in Cope's words, Purbright knew the quiet mystery of the bell had only just begun to ring. The blue roadster had scarcely disappeared round the bend when the Abbey's gate swung open again, this time revealing a figure of entirely different disposition. Dr. Lionel Halbert, a man whose fondness for antiquities was matched only by the severity of his eyebrow line, strode out with the solemnity of a man who believed heritage was a matter of personal guardianship. He carried a leather satchel under one arm and looked faintly affronted by the breeze, as though nature had no right to interfere with his errands. Purbright paused. Halbert spotted him at once and altered his stride, approaching with the self-importance of a lecturer who has been waiting to present crucial information. "Inspector," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "I trust you are aware that the Abbey's bell is in a state of dreadful neglect." "Something of that sort has been mentioned," Purbright replied. "Neglect invariably precedes calamity," Halbert continued, warming to his theme. "I warned the monks last autumn that the wheel mechanism needed servicing. You can't expect centuries-old wood to withstand fluctuations in humidity without consequence. I have observed, Purbright said mildly, that the damage appears to be the result of a deliberate cut. Halberd pursed his lips. Yes, that is what Brother Edgar tells me. Highly irregular. Though I suppose when an object holds historical value, there is always the risk that someone might become covetous. Of the bell? Purbright asked. Of what the bell represents, Halberd said. Some bells are merely sound makers, others hold ceremonial significance. Crescent Abbey's bell, for instance, has an inscription relating to ancestral bonds and debt settlements, unusual but not unique. Medieval monastic communities often served as guardians of public agreements. Purbright absorbed this with quiet interest. You seem well acquainted with the Abbey's history. I've made a study of it, Halberd said proudly. Their archives are quite rich, albeit poorly, catalogued, and I understand a representative from a London firm visited them last week regarding a potential appraisal of sacred artifacts. That piqued Purbright's attention. Do you know which firm? Raven and Creed, I believe, a rather prestigious group. Their valuations tend to precede auctions, though naturally the monks wouldn't admit to such intentions. They fear appearing mercenary. Purbright thanked Halberd, who left with the satisfied air of someone who had imparted more wisdom than his listener might be capable of absorbing. The inspector began walking toward town, but he had gone only a few steps when he heard hurried footsteps behind him. This time it was Marion Blest, the town's only professional bell restorer, who possessed the sturdy build of someone accustomed to ladders and the glare of high windows. She carried a toolbox and wore an expression of indignation, sharpened to a fine point. "Inspector Purbright," she called. "Just the man I need to complain to." "Complaints can be soothing when properly expressed," Purbright said. Blest drew up beside him. "I've just spoken to Brother Matthew. He wants me to inspect the bell. Are you very discreetly?" he said, as though the thing were a scandalous relative hidden in the attic. "I told him I don't perform repairs in secrecy. It's undignified." "I see," Purbright replied. "Did he say why he wanted discretion?" "No," she snapped. "Just fussed about public misunderstanding." "Rubbish. If something's broken, it should be fixed openly, but the monks seem terrified of someone discovering the precise damage." Purbright glanced at her toolbox. "Are you familiar with clamps or braces that leave rectangular impressions on bell wheels?" Blest blinked in surprise. "Rectangular? That's not part of any restoration method I use. Some amateurs use crude metal plates to hold a wheel steady during evaluation, usually because they don't understand proper rope tensioning." "Would a professional use such a method?" "A professional," Blest said with withering emphasis, "would not use a method resembling carpentry performed under duress." Her indignation was genuine. Purbright made a mental note to consider the skill set implied in the mark on the wheel, neither careless nor expert, but pragmatic. Blest gave the inspector a curt nod and marched off toward the tower, muttering loudly about incompetent meddling. The path led onward into town, where Purbright crossed the market square and turned toward the municipal library. He was not seeking books so much as the librarian, Miss Tremble, who possessed a memory of town events so precise that many suspected her of indexing them chronologically. Sure enough, she materialized behind the counter the moment she heard footsteps. "Inspector Purbright," she said with a small, ceremonious smile. "I imagine you are here for information regarding the Abbey." "Very perceptive," Purbright admitted. "Have you heard anything about an appraisal performed there last week?" Miss Tremble nodded. "Ah, yes. Brother Edgar borrowed our handbook on medieval ecclesiastical valuations last Friday. He seemed rather anxious about the matter, I asked whether he feared the loss of a relic, but he only said, "Loss is one thing, recognition is another." "Recognition," Purbright repeated. "In what sense?" "I could not say," Miss Tremble replied, "but I did overhear him on the telephone requesting confirmation about the legal standing of historical agreements tied to ceremonial objects." His tone suggested a certain urgency. Purbright thanked her and stepped back into the afternoon light. The threads were multiplying. Cope's pressure on the monks, Halbert's knowledge of the bell's ceremonial role, the visit from an appraiser, a wooden wedge left behind, and a crude brace mark on the bell wheel. None yet formed a coherent shape, but he sensed they belonged to the same quiet tapestry. He walked further down High Street, passing a bakery, where the day's gossip was marinating into exaggerated certainty. Near the fountain, he spotted Mr. Chigwell, the bursar, emerging from a shop carrying a small brown envelope. His expression was fretful, as if the envelope contained more worry than paper. When Chigwell noticed Purbright, he attempted a smile that bent under the weight of anxiety. "Inspector," he said, "I do hope you are not dwelling on that unfortunate business at the Abbey. It was an aberration." "Most aberrations," Purbright replied gently, "are created with intention." Chigwell shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I fear the monks are unsettled. The Abbey has been under strain lately, not financially, well, not solely financially, but historically too. Old obligations resurfacing. Nothing dangerous, mind you, just technicalities." Purbright regarded him for a quiet moment. "Do these technicalities involve land?" Chigwell's face stiffened. Who told you?" "No one," Purbright said. "But circumstances suggest a certain alignment of interests." The bursar clutched the envelope to his chest. "Please, Inspector, if you could avoid drawing public attention before matters are clarified, it would ease a considerable burden." Purbright inclined his head, but offered no promise. As Chigwell hurried away, the inspector considered the man's unease. Old obligations, land, a bell tied to debt rituals, and someone determined to keep it from ringing. The smallest details, imprints, wedges, glances, words chosen too carefully, were beginning to form a pattern. He continued down the road, the faint sound of the wind stirring through the Abbey's distant ivy. It seemed almost like a whisper, urging him to keep listening. For the bell, though silent, was speaking louder with every clue. The evening settled over Flaxborough with the kind of soft amber quiet that usually encouraged the town to retire early, but Inspector Purbright felt an odd expectancy lingering in the air as he walked home from the station. The conversation with Chigwell still hung in his thoughts. Old obligations, land, technicalities. Words chosen with care, and yet so revealing in their attempt at concealment. It was as though the Abbey, with all its serene stone and ivy, had been carrying a secret that someone feared would soon step into the light. He had scarcely hung his coat when the telephone rang, its insistence slicing through the calm. The voice on the line belonged to Sergeant Malley, rarely flustered, but unmistakably rattled now. "Inspector, you'd better come at once," Malley said. "There's been another incident at the Abbey." Purbright replaced his coat without a word. By the time he reached Crescent Abbey, the grounds were a huddle of lanterns and startled figures. A wind had picked up, combing through the trees with restless fingers, and the monks stood near the gate in nervous formation, their robes stirring like uneasy shadows. The air smelled of disturbed dust and damp metal. Malley hurried forward. "It happened not 20 minutes ago. Someone tried to remove the bell." Purbright followed him toward the tower. The door, which earlier had been merely old and stubborn, was now visibly damaged. The latch hung twisted, splintered wood littering the ground. Inside, the staircase was dusted with debris, chips of stone, fragments of wood, and the faint metallic scent of tools recently handled. At the top, the bell chamber bore unmistakable evidence of intrusion. The bell itself remained in place, but it listed slightly to one side, as though someone had attempted to unseat it from its cradle. Deep gouge marks scarred the supporting beam beneath, and on the floor, caught in the crooked join between two planks, lay a metal spanner engraved with the initials M.B. Malley. Lifted it carefully. "Dropped in a hurry, I'd say." Purbright examined the tool without touching it. Marion Blest, the bell restorer, had marked her tools with her initials following a dispute with a former apprentice who had been overly fond of borrowing. "Is Miss Blest still on the grounds?" Purbright asked. Malley nodded. "Downstairs. She said she'd been in the refectory when she heard something. Could have sworn someone was up here, but by the time she arrived, whoever it was had vanished." Purbright descended the stairs, weighing the implications. A dropped tool, a forced latch, a bell nearly levered from its housing. This was far bolder than the discreet rope-cutting. Whoever had interfered tonight was either desperate or losing patience. Marion Blest stood near the cloister archway, arms folded and expression sharpened into outrage. "Inspector, someone has manhandled that bell," she said at once. "Manhandled. I don't say that lightly. It takes a certain level of idiocy to think you can pry a 200-year-old bell out of its cradle alone." "Is this spanner yours?" Purbright asked gently. She bristled. "Of course it is. I had it in my toolbox earlier, but it's missing now. Someone must have taken it." "Who had access to your tools today?" "Anyone passing through," she said, with a scowl. "The monks, the volunteers, that antiquarian fellow, Halberd, poking around asking questions as though he owned the place. And Cope, if he wandered in. I saw him skulking about the grounds earlier, pretending to admire architecture." The monks hovered nearby in a state of escalating agitation. Brother Matthew wrung his hands in rhythmic distress. Brother Llewellyn paced in tiny steps, and Brother Edgar stood like a stone figure whose cracks were slowly widening. "Did any of you hear anything unusual in the last hour?" Purbright asked. Brother Matthew responded first. "A faint clatter from the tower. I thought perhaps the wind had caught the shutters." Brother Edgar's voice was softer. There was a moment, a creaking sound, as if weight had shifted. Brother Llewellyn looked pale. "I heard footsteps," he whispered. "Light, but hurried." Purbright studied their faces. Fear was genuine enough, though its origin remained ambiguous. Chigwell, arriving breathlessly from the guest-house, looked ready to collapse. "Inspector," he pleaded, "please tell me this was not deliberate." Purbright said nothing. His silence was answer enough. The bursar's shoulders sagged. "This is disastrous. Do you know what it means if someone is trying to remove that bell?" Purbright waited. Chigwell glanced nervously at the monks. "If the bell is taken from its mount, even temporarily, the Abbey's historical agreement with the surrounding land becomes subject to renegotiation." "Is that why Mr. Cope is interested?" Purbright asked. Chigwell flinched. "I can't say, but he has been unusually persistent lately, and I believe he recently subpoenaed some documents relating to the Abbey's holdings." Purbright let the implications settle. Cope's interest, the visit from the appraisers, the rope cut before the garden open day, the clues were aligning not around theft of the bell, but avoidance of something the bell signified. "Inspector," Malley said quietly. "The locked gate at the north path was found open. Tracks suggest a vehicle came right up to the outer wall." Purbright frowned. "Blue?" "Blue," Malley confirmed. "Shiny enough to catch moonlight." Vivian Cope. The man had not tried very hard to hide his irritation earlier that day. Now it seemed irritation had graduated to action. Still, Purbright felt a hesitation. Cope was ambitious, aggressive, but not the sort who would personally crawl up a narrow medieval tower with a stolen spanner and attempt to heave a bell loose. His ego preferred delegation. He surveyed the grounds again. The wind fluttered through, the cloister vines making the shadows dance unevenly. The monks whispered in a tight cluster, perhaps praying, perhaps strategizing. Blessed continued muttering darkly about amateurs. Chigwell dabbed sweat from his brow. Purbright turned back to Mally. "Search the area behind the outer wall. Whoever attempted this may have left more than tracks." Mally nodded and hurried off with 2 constables. The inspector returned his gaze to the tower. The bell hung crooked, unsettled, yet it remained. And perhaps that was the most telling thing of all. Someone had tried to silence it entirely, but had failed, either from haste or interruption. As he walked toward the gate, Purbright allowed himself a moment of contemplation. The pattern was clarifying, not in its specifics, but in its attitude. This was no random vandalism. Someone was afraid. Someone felt threatened by the bell's continued presence. And fear often made people clumsy. He paused at the end of the path, looking back at Crescent Abbey silhouetted against the lantern glow. The night wind carried a faint metallic sigh from the tower, almost like the bell attempting to speak. Someone wanted that voice gone. Purbright intended to find out why. Purbright did not return home immediately after leaving the Abbey. Instead, he made his way back to the station, walking slowly through the dimly lit streets as though the night itself were a long corridor in which thoughts could be arranged neatly along the walls. The second incident in the tower had given shape to the mystery, though not yet its full dimensions. Fear, intent, haste, 3 qualities rarely shared by a single mind unless driven by something weightier than mischief or greed. There was purpose behind the attack on the bell, and purpose had a habit of leaving traces more reliable than footprints. Inside his office, Purbright switched on the desk lamp and lowered himself into his chair with the quiet satisfaction of a man returning to an unfinished puzzle. The room felt companionably still. Papers lay where he had left them. The faint smell of old ink and dust settled like a familiar blanket. This was the space in which he could listen to thoughts that did not demand immediate conversation. He took out the wooden wedge he had found in the tower. It was unremarkable in appearance, yet the broken edge suggested force, applied awkwardly, perhaps by someone unused to makeshift engineering. Not the work of Marion Blessed, whose craftsmanship possessed the tidy efficiency of a well-tuned clock. No, this wedge belonged to someone who resorted to improvisation under pressure. He set it aside and picked up his notes on Vivian Cope. The man had motive, ambition disguised as urban development. Cope had a talent for turning heritage into opportunity, provided the heritage did not speak too loudly in protest. And the Abbey, with its old debts and older land rights, had evidently found its voice in the bell. Yet Cope himself did not strike Purbright as a climber of medieval staircases. His impatience was not the kind that tolerated manual labour. He preferred to act through others, professionals, contractors, or those easily persuaded. But who among the Abbey's orbit might be so persuaded? Dr. Halberd, perhaps? A scholar with a reverence for sacred artifacts that bordered on possessiveness. Someone who might feel the bell deserved a better guardian. But Halberd's outrage seemed more academic than personal. And his build was the wrong sort for stealthy climbs. Marion Blessed had both the tools and the knowledge to tamper with a bell, but not the temperament. Her anger was direct, forthright, and loud, qualities difficult to reconcile with the secrecy required for nocturnal dismantling. Besides, her missing spanner could just as easily have been stolen as volunteered. Purbright leaned back, folding his hands behind his head. He let his mind settle into the quiet rhythm he trusted most, a slow, almost meditative sifting of impressions. He allowed each face to drift through memory. Brother Llewellyn's twitchy anxiety, Brother Matthew's rehearsed calm, Brother Edgar's gentle evasions, Chigwell's trembling worry. Ah, Chigwell. Of all the Abbey's figures, the bursar carried the heaviest tension. His fear was not that of a man hiding guilt, but of one watching something precarious slide toward collapse. He knew more than he dared share. And while fear did not make a man guilty, it often guided him toward revealing who was. Purbright reached for the telephone but paused. It was late, and fear nurtured in the dark had a tendency to sprout confusion rather than clarity. Better to speak with the bursar in daylight when panic had less room to expand. He turned instead to the matter of the ancient inscription Halberd had mentioned, bells tied to debt settlements. It was an unusual tradition, though not unheard of. Some medieval estates had used ceremonial bells to mark the renewal of land rights or the confirmation of long-standing agreements. If Crescent Abbey's bell held such a function, its ringing or its silence might have significant implications. A thought stirred. What if the bells ringing at the garden open day had been expected? What if someone had anticipated a public sounding, one that would legally reinforce the Abbey's claim to its land? And what if silencing the bell had been an attempt to prevent that claim from being reaffirmed? He lifted his pen and made a note. Was bell scheduled for ceremonial ringing? The monks had not mentioned it directly, but their discomfort around the subject suggested omissions. He tapped the pen lightly. If the bell's annual tolling carried legal weight, then cutting the rope was the first act of avoidance. Attempting to remove the bell entirely was the second, and the fear that the bell might ring, despite interference, was the motive underlying both. It was time to examine the contradictions offered in statements. He opened his notebook and drew a line down the centre. On one side he wrote Llewellyn, claimed mechanical failure, jittery, heard footsteps. On the other, Edgar, philosophical, conflicted, referred to recognition in Miss Tremble's account. Then Matthew, eager to appease, overly rehearsed. Chigwell, evasive, but genuinely frightened. Purbright paused at Brother Edgar's name. Recognition. Of what, or of whom? His thoughts drifted back to Miss Tremble's report, the archivist's handbook borrowed, the phone call inquiring about historical agreements. Why had Edgar, the gentle elder, taken sudden interest in the legal standing of ceremonial objects? Was he worried someone might challenge the Abbey's claim? Or was he concerned the Abbey itself might lose something long protected? And who would benefit if the bell failed to ring at a specific time? Vivian Cope, certainly, but also anyone entangled in land disputes, inheritances, or debts tied to Abbey boundaries. Purbright made another note. Check land registry, old covenants. He preferred not to pry into dusty legal matters, but mysteries often hid in parchment as easily as in shadows. He set the notebook aside and allowed his gaze to drift toward the window. Outside, the lamplight cast a soft glow across the quiet car park. The roses beneath the sill moved gently in the breeze, their petals whispering against each other. It was a peaceful sight, at odds with the shifting unease surrounding the Abbey. But peace, he reflected, was often a fragile veneer covering obligations long neglected. He closed his eyes briefly, letting his mind rest. Somewhere in the puzzle lay a thread that, once pulled, would unravel the entire pattern. The second incident had tightened that thread, drawing the pieces closer. Soon someone would slip, not out of malice, but out of pressure. And Inspector Purbright, with his patient attention to the spaces between words, would be there when they did. When he opened his eyes again, the room felt even quieter. He reached forward, extinguished the lamp, and let the darkness settle like ink on fresh paper. The Abbey was waiting for morning, and so was he. Morning arrived with a pale, distracted sunlight that seemed unsure whether to brighten the day or leave it to its own devices. Inspector Purbright reached Crescent Abbey shortly after 9, walking with the calm deliberation of someone approaching a conversation rather than a confrontation. The monks were gathered in the cloister, their voices low, anxious, and so tightly woven that they carried more silence than sound. Chigwell stood apart from them, clutching his ledger as though it were a shield. Purbright greeted them with a polite nod, then addressed Brother Edgar. "I'd be grateful if we might speak in the refectory," he said mildly. "A brief discussion, nothing formal." The monk's eyes flickered, an instinctive flinch, but he inclined his head with the same slow dignity that accompanied all his movements. "Of course, Inspector." The refectory was cool and sparsely furnished, its long tables holding the faint scent of tea and last night's bread. Purbright waited until Edgar had taken a seat opposite him. The monk rested his hands on the table, but his fingers twitched slightly, unable to find stillness. "I've been thinking," Purbright began, "about the bell, what it means to the Abbey, what it means to others." Edgar's gaze shifted, not evasively, but with the weary resignation of someone expecting discomfort. "It is more than a ceremonial object," Purbright continued, "more than a tradition. Its ringing has significance beyond sound." Edgar inhaled softly. "Its history is, complicated." "So I gathered," Purbright said. "I'm told that the bell once marked the renewal of land agreements, agreements that may still be legally alive despite their age." "That is correct," Edgar said, his voice nearly a whisper, "though the legalities are obscure." "And Mr. Cope," Purbright added, "is not a man who likes obscure legalities, particularly when land is involved." Edgar closed his eyes briefly. He has made his desires plain. "He wants a portion of the Abbey grounds?" Purbright asked. "The meadow to the north," Edgar admitted. "A long-standing parcel, valuable, though rarely used. He insists its potential is wasted." "And the monk's refusal," Purbright said gently, "would be rendered weaker if the bell were removed or rendered unable to fulfill its symbolic role." Edgar swallowed. "The Abbey's right to the meadow is tied to the annual tolling at noon on the first day of the garden open day. If the bell fails to ring, the agreement may be challenged by any party claiming the rights have lapsed." Purbright nodded slowly. Then the silence was not just symbolic, it was strategic. Edgar looked down at his hands. "We feared this." Chigwell discovered papers in the archive, old covenants, written in archaic Latin. He almost fainted reading them. The meadow was granted under conditions of stewardship, reaffirmed yearly. Without the bell, the lineage of rights cracks like old plaster. "Enough," Purbright said softly. "You needn't fear I misunderstand, but I must ask, why not tell me this sooner?" Edgar's voice grew faint. "Because fear makes fools of us all, Inspector. We hoped the silence was simply misfortune. We hoped you would not dig too deeply." Purbright regarded him calmly. "I always dig deeply, brother, but politely." Edgar gave a strained smile. "That is precisely what worried us." Purbright let the silence settle before continuing. "There is something else. Someone attempted last night to remove the bell entirely." Edgar's hands tightened. "Yes, I heard the commotion. I prayed it was a dream." "It was not," Purbright said. "A tool was left behind, a stolen tool, and a poor attempt at leverage." "Who would do such a thing?" Edgar asked, genuine dismay trembling at the edges of his voice. "I believe," Purbright said, "we are looking at someone who understands the law, but not bells." Edgar's brow furrowed. "Cope?" "Perhaps, but Cope likes to keep his fingers clean. Tools left behind suggest a hurried job, someone unpracticed in physical work." Edgar's eyes widened. "Chigwell?" Purbright shook his head. "Fearful, yes. Capable of lifting a bell? No, he faints over paperwork." "Then who?" "That," Purbright said, "is why I've arranged a small gathering, a polite discussion, a chance for each party to hear a question not meant to trap them, yet which will trap only one." "What question?" Edgar asked. "You will hear it soon enough." Purbright rose, signalling the conversation's end, and stepped into the cloister. He found Chigwell, Cope, Halberd, Marian Blest, and the three monks gathering with varying degrees of confusion and reluctance. The group looked like a mismatched parish committee, anxious, impatient, or offended depending on temperament. Purbright stood before them, hands clasped gently behind his back. "Thank you for coming. I wish to clarify one matter concerning the bell. A simple question." Cope gave a dismissive snort. "If this is an inquisition, Inspector, I must remind you—" "No inquisition," Purbright said serenely. "Merely curiosity." He let the pause stretch, drawing the faint tension taut. "Yesterday," he continued, "I inspected the bell wheel and noticed a rectangular mark, clearly made by a metal brace recently applied. Someone attempted to steady the wheel before cutting the rope. Now, such bracing is not typical in bell maintenance. It requires a tool of specific shape." Purbright turned toward the group with gentle interest. "Could any of you tell me," he asked slowly, "what kind of brace would leave an impression 6 inches long, 1 inch wide, with rounded edges on a wooden curve?" Silence fell, not fearful, but calculating. Marian Blest frowned. "Not one I'd use. That sounds like the base plate of a portable car jack." Purbright nodded slightly. He had not said car jack. She had. Vivian Cope shifted, expression tightening. "That means nothing. Anyone could recognize that description." "Indeed," Purbright said, "but only someone who used it would know exactly where on the wheel it would fit. It would require standing in the bell chamber awkwardly during daylight. The cut rope was discovered just after noon, which means someone was there earlier." Cope's composure flickered. Brief, but enough. Purbright watched him. "So, Mr. Cope, you told me you merely passed by the Abbey yesterday morning, but the tower is not visible from the road. You would have had to walk through the courtyard, climb the tower stairs, brace the wheel, and cut the rope." Cope's jaw tightened. "This is absurd." Purbright turned slightly. "Then perhaps you can explain why your car's tires left fresh tracks near the north wall last night." The silence collapsed into stillness. Edgar whispered a soft prayer. Chigwell looked ready to faint. Marian Blest clenched her fists, and Cope, shoulders stiff, eyes narrowing, said nothing. Purbright smiled gently. "Do not worry, I am not accusing you, not yet. I merely wished to see who reacted." Cope swallowed hard, and in that motion lay all the confirmation Purbright required. Not guilt proven, but guilt trembling. The trap had been set with one question, and it had caught exactly the thread Purbright expected. The tension that followed Purbright's quiet implication of Vivian Cope unfolded like a ripple across a still pond, expanding slowly, touching each person present with its hush. Cope's jaw had locked so tightly that a muscle twitched near his temple, and his eyes carried the unmistakable spark of a man who had miscalculated. Yet he forced a snort of contempt attempting to retrieve the posture of a wronged businessman. "This is nonsense," Cope said. "Coincidence dressed up as deduction." Purbright nodded mildly. "Coincidences do enjoy disguises, but they rarely hold shape when examined closely." The group waited, some tense, some bewildered, while Purbright regarded the row of faces with the patient, almost pastoral calm that always preceded one of his explanations. But he did not begin immediately. He let the silence deepen, giving each person a chance to settle into the realization that answers were finally assembling. He turned first to Brother Edgar. "I would like to start," Purbright said, "with the bell's function, its true function, which you attempted to keep discreetly buried. Your reluctance was understandable, but ultimately counterproductive." Edgar bowed his head. "Fear made us cautious, Inspector." "And it made others bold," Purbright replied softly. "The bell, as we now know, is tied to an old covenant. Its annual tolling reaffirms the Abbey's right to the northern meadow. No ringing, no claim." Chigwell made a hollow sound of despair, clutching his ledger as though it might provide absolution. "We hoped the matter would remain forgotten. The clauses are obscure, the language archaic." "Yet not archaic enough," Purbright said, turning calmly toward Cope. "Mr. Cope is a man who reads opportunity in old ink as easily as others read newsprint." Cope's lips thinned. "Legitimate business interest. The meadow sits idle." "Idle, yes," Purbright agreed, "but only until the bell rings, and you could not afford for it to ring yesterday. The Garden Open Day provided the perfect occasion, a crowd expecting the bell, watching the tower. If the rope failed at the crucial moment, the non-ringing could be attributed to age rather than interference, a failed tradition, a lapse, one you would later cite when challenging the Abbey's claim." Cope's silence was a fragile, brittle thing. Purbright continued, "And so the rope was cut, not slashed by chance, but severed neatly, with a brace and a portable jack to stabilize the wheel. A crude but effective method, if one does not understand bells properly." Marion, blessed, glared at Cope. "Only a fool would use a car jack on an 18th century wheel." Cope ignored her. "But that was only the first part," Purbright went on. "The second part came last night, when someone attempted to remove the bell altogether. Perhaps you feared the monks would repair the rope quickly, or perhaps you learned the bell could be struck manually even without rope or wheel." "And you blame me for this?" Cope demanded, summoning incredulous outrage. "Inspector, I'm a developer, not a thief. I don't go climbing towers like some criminal in a penny novel." "Indeed," Purbright said, "I quite agree. You do not climb towers. You do not tug ropes. You do not pry at beams with spanners stolen from a bell restorer. You prefer to delegate." The group collectively inhaled. Cope stiffened. "Delegate? To whom?" "To someone with a more flexible sense of responsibility," Purbright said pleasantly. "Someone who has been at your side for months, through council meetings and planning sessions. Someone who believes in your vision and benefits from your ambition." Cope blinked. "Nevin?" Purbright nodded slightly. Cope's assistant, Nevin Tull, had been conspicuously absent since the morning's events. A young man with more enthusiasm than judgment, always eager to please, always eager to impress. Purbright had observed him in the background earlier in the week, listening attentively, nodding quickly, disappearing just as quickly. "I imagine Mr. Tull did the physical work," Purbright said, "borrowing Miss Blest's spanner when she set down her toolbox during the afternoon tour, bracing the wheel earlier in the day, cutting the rope, and last night attempting to remove the bell, although he was interrupted and fled, dropping the spanner." Cope rubbed his forehead, a rare crack in his polished confidence. If that idiot touched anything... Purbright raised a hand, gently. "He's culpable, yes." But the intention, the motive, originated elsewhere. Cope's indignation flared. "I never told him to damage anything." "No," Purbright agreed. "I suspect you framed it as protecting our future investment." He would have interpreted that with more zeal than discernment. Cope's silence returned, this time less brittle, more defeated. Brother Matthew whispered, "But why silence the bell entirely? Why attempt its removal?" Purbright turned toward the brothers, because by last night Mr. Tull, or perhaps Cope himself, had realized cutting the rope was not enough. If the monks employed Miss Blessed, the bell could be repaired before any challenge was filed. But if the bell were damaged or removed, even temporarily, the yearly rite of reaffirmation could not proceed at all, and the Meadows' claim would lapse into legal ambiguity. Chickwell uttered a strangled gasp. "So all of this, for land?" "For land," Purbright said gently, "and for profit. Motivation's older than the Abbey itself." Dr. Halberd cleared his throat. "If I may," he said, "removing the bell would also have endangered its lineage. The historical record would have suffered." "Thank you, Dr. Halberd," Purbright interrupted with courteous firmness. The inspector looked again at Cope. "Fear drove you. Fear that the bell would ring. Fear that the old covenant would be honoured once more. And when people fear what a sound might signify, they often try to silence it." Cope met his gaze for the first time without pretense. "You think you know everything, Inspector?" Purbright shook his head. "I know only enough, but enough will do." Malley stepped forward. "Sir, shall I send officers to detain Mr. Tull?" Purbright nodded. "Politely, Sergeant. He will likely confess without resistance." Cope sank onto a bench, shoulders heavy, not the posture of a villain, but of a man undone by his own impatience. He did not speak further, and Purbright did not press him. Sometimes the quiet after revelation was its own consequence. The monks stood together, shaken but relieved. The Abbey's silence, imposed by fear, had finally been broken. Purbright allowed the room a moment to breathe before he spoke again, his voice soft, almost pastoral. "The bell was never the prize," he said, "only the symbol, and symbols, when threatened, speak louder than any sound they make." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint rustle of ivy against stone, a whisper of stability returning. Purbright glanced toward the tower, then back at the group. "I believe the Abbey may ring more steadily now." It was not just a statement. It was a closing. In the wake of Purbright's quiet unravelling of the plot, Crescent Abbey entered a peculiar lull, a silence not imposed this time, but earned through weariness and relief. The monks moved through the cloister with softened steps, as though afraid to disturb the fragile return of normality. Even the ivy on the tower seemed to hang more calmly, stirred only by the occasional breeze that brushed past like a sigh of release. Later that afternoon, Sergeant Malley returned from the neighbouring district with Nevin Tull in custody. The young man did not struggle. Indeed, he seemed almost grateful to be relieved of whatever burdens his misguided loyalty had placed upon him. When Purbright entered the interview room, Nevin looked up with red-rimmed eyes, clutching a handkerchief in both fists. "I only meant to help Mr. Cope," he said, before Purbright had settled into the chair. "He said the monks were being unreasonable, that the town needed the development, that the meadow would be wasted unless someone took action." Purbright nodded, not condemning him, not absolving him, simply listening. "And he asked you to silence the bell?" Nevin shook his head miserably. "He never asked. He only complained. Over and over, he said if the bell didn't ring, the meadow would finally be up for discussion. He said he'd make sure the council knew who deserved credit for progress." A tremor ran through him. I thought if I did something helpful, if I solved the problem, it would show him I could handle responsibility. Responsibility, Purbright repeated, letting the words settle gently between them. A heavy concept when taken too literally. Nevin lowered his gaze. I didn't know about the history, the covenant. I just acted. Purbright believed him. The clumsy method, the poor timing, the panic that had caused him to flee the tower after dropping the spanner, all aligned with the behaviour of a young man eager to impress but lacking the judgment to realize he was stepping into centuries-old shadows. "We'll set down your statement," Purbright said softly, "and the courts will determine the appropriate consequence. But you have saved yourself trouble by speaking plainly." Nevin nodded, tears threatening again. "Mr. Cope, does he know?" "He knows enough," Purbright said, "and will face his own inquiries." Outside the interview room, Mally waited with the patient heaviness of a man who understood both guilt and foolishness in human proportions. "Sir," he said quietly, "you think Cope will try to shift the blame entirely?" "It would be in character," Purbright replied. "But difficult. Fear leaves long shadows. People step into them." Mally nodded, and Purbright returned to his office, feeling the slow settling of a puzzle now nearly complete. By early evening, Crescent Abbey had regained a faint hum of routine. The monks lit their lamps, prepared their evening prayers, and moved through their duties with earnest gratitude. The damaged wheel mechanism had been safely secured, preventing any further attempts at removal. Marion Blest had taken charge of the inspection, loudly, decisively, and with an air of vindicated professionalism. She greeted Purbright near the tower door, wiping her hands on a cloth already streaked with the day's dust. "Well," she announced, "the bell's not beyond saving. It's sulked long enough, but I'll put it right." Purbright smiled. "A relieved community will thank you." Marion snorted. "The community? They'll gossip about whether I overcharged, but the bell will be fine." Brother Edgar approached then, his expression calm but touched with residual humility. "Inspector Purbright," he said, "I wish to apologize once more for our earlier evasions. Fear clouded our judgment." "Fear," Purbright said, "is a natural companion to old truths. You handled it with more grace than most." Edgar lowered his head. "It was not grace, it was reluctance. We have held that meadow for generations. We feared its loss more than we feared transparency." "And now?" "And now," Edgar said, "we understand that truth cannot be guarded by omission. The bell will ring again next year, and the covenant will stand." Purbright inclined his head. "That is wise." As he walked through the cloister, the rustle of robes followed him like a quiet tide. Chigwell, somewhat revived and considerably less pale, scurried after him with nervous gratitude. "Inspector," he said breathlessly, "I cannot thank you enough. I feared the Abbey would crumble under this." "The Abbey has weathered worse," Purbright said. "Human schemes tend to be less durable than stone." Chigwell exhaled in what might have been relief or lingering guilt, then hurried back to his ledger as though its columns could steady him. Stepping out through the main gate, Purbright paused to take in the view of the meadow. The evening light stretched across it, gold and soft, touching the grass with the calm assurance of continuity. It was unremarkable land, quiet, modest, but it held a history that stubbornly refused to be erased by ambition or desperation. On his walk back to town, Purbright passed familiar faces already discussing the day's revelations. Mrs. Ingledew speculated that the bell might be cursed. Mr. Cobbett insisted the council should erect a protective fence around it. Mrs. Glossop claimed She had always suspected Cope's aura was too sharp to be trustworthy. Purbright offered polite nods, intervening in none of the conversations. Flaxborough's gossip had its own momentum and corrected itself eventually, like a river meandering until it found its natural course. By the time he reached the station, the sky had deepened into a soft indigo. He returned to his office, where the rosebush outside brushed lightly against the glass, making a sound like pages turning. The quiet was familiar, comforting. He loosened his tie, sat down, and began the paperwork with resigned patience. The day's events, he reflected, had unfolded not through violence or dramatic confrontation, but through the slow unravelling of human motives, ambition, fear, misjudgment, all wrapped around a piece of metal that had simply been asked to ring. When he finally closed the last file and set his pen aside, the room seemed to exhale with him. Outside, the town of Flaxborough eased into its usual rhythms, windows glowing, kettles boiling, dogs settling at their hearths. Life resumed the calm it cherished, a calm that always felt, to Purbright, both earned and fragile. He rose, turned off the lamp, and let the peaceful silence settle once more. The bell would ring again next year, and Purbright, with his quiet diligence, would be ready for whatever else chose to disturb Flaxborough's gentle routines.